So I'm John Anderson. I'm a principal consultant at Network to Code, and I'm also one of the core committers of the Nautobot project that we are open sourcing. So what I'm going to start out with today is talking about the source of truth that is at the core of Nautobot, and specifically how it is extensible, how it's been made flexible to support a variety of different use cases and organizational specific needs. So going back to kind of the three core tenets of what we're doing with Nautobot. This fits within the flexible source of truth for networking. And to jump right in, the source of truth data model is quite interesting, because when we talk about network automation, fundamentally we need data to do certain types of automation. As we go up the ladder in our network automation journey, we need more and more data, and specifically we need that data to be a realistic representation of the networks that we're trying to automate. And so what we wind up building over time is this data model that represents the real world of the network that we're trying to automate. And so we call this our network data model. And so Nautobot implements a core network data model itself. So, what comes out of the box when you install Nautobot is this data model that will appeal to a broad set of use cases in terms of network automation. And it is intended to serve as the source of truth for that networking data. Now, however, we recognize that there's always going to be organizational specific requirements and constraints that are going to change the way that you think about that data model and change the way that you really need that data to work for you. And so Nautobot has a couple of very specific features around the flexibility of the data model that I'm going to go over here now. And then also we have the plugin ecosystem that I'm going to kind of dive a little bit into, but you're going to hear a lot about in the rest of today's presentations. So if we take a brief step backwards to think about what is a data model. If we think about a lot of network engineers may be new to network automation, and when you're getting into it, you may hear these terms: source of truth, data model, all of this kind of thing. What does it actually mean? Again, to do effective network automation, we need all of the data that represents our network. So if we take, a network design that Jason talked about, fundamentally network automation is very successful when we base it off of the principles of the network designs that we're trying to actually implement in the real world. If we take one of those and think of like a network diagram here, we can start to pinpoint all of the different types of data that we need to model to create our source of truth. So we've got obviously devices and IP addresses, obvious things like that, but perhaps less obvious things that we're also trying to model, like the cable connections that exist between two interfaces that form a peering, circuits, and then also more metadata things like what is the role of a device, what is the role of an interface within the context of our network. So that's what we're really trying to do, is take the network that we've got out there and model it so that we can start manipulating that data and represent that data in terms of our source of truth so that we can automate with it. So when we think about Nautobot's data model and how it is flexible, it's really a series of layers. And so at the very center, we've got the core data model. This is, again, like I mentioned, this is, if you install Nautobot, this is what you're going to get out of the box. And again, it's going to be things like devices, tracking sites or regions, VLANs, prefixes, all the types of stuff that, as a network practitioner are going to be quite obvious, right? But if we think about organizational specific use cases and needs, there's going to be things that aren't in that data model, or that maybe don't make specific sense to us. And so we have other features like custom fields. It would be the next layer, where we can define organizational specific attributes to that data model that allow us to service our own use cases. So I might have a set of custom fields as a Nautobot user that might be different than your set of custom fields and so forth, because we have two different use cases, two different network designs that we're trying to automate that have different needs. Relationships is a really cool feature that we've implemented in Nautobot specifically. This allows us to build custom associations between the different models, between the different data. So VLANs, like Jason mentioned, are quite popular in this context. So say we've got racks, and in our network design, we need to know, what is the management VLAN that's typically associated with that rack. So with relationships, we can do that. We can create a custom relationship between the VLAN model and the rack model, and we can tie that association. And why that's important is from a data integrity standpoint, so that we know that that relationship exists, and it's not just dependent on some business logic that's loosely defined somewhere in the tooling of our network automation stack. You know, we can enforce it at the source of truth, and make sure that it stays that way over time. And then the next layer above that is the plugin and app ecosystem. This encompasses larger bodies of functionality that developers and end users can implement. But what's really neat about plugins is they're also intended to not only service organizational specific needs, but to be shareable, right? So that we can service common use cases that maybe not every single user of Nautobot would need, but that a large community might. You know, a large subset of users, like maybe BGP peering, for instance, could be a plugin that someone could implement, and lots of Nautobot users could make use of by installing it. So let's talk about a couple of these features in a little bit more depth. Let's talk about custom fields first. So as I mentioned, this is attribute level data that we are augmenting the existing data model with. So they're treated like regular database fields, and that's important because they have native support in all of the different interfaces that we would interact with the data in Nautobot, specifically in the web UI, the REST API, GraphQL, which you'll hear from Damien about, which is very cool, and the ORM for things like custom jobs and so forth. And then specifically in Nautobot, we have expanded custom fields to all of the models so that you can do whatever things you need to do with the data model to support your specific needs. Again, going back to that need for flexibility in the source of truth to support network automation at scale. And so obviously custom fields have lots of tie-ins to network automation, you know, specific use cases like defining the role on an interface or assigning additional metadata context to a device role, for instance. Things like configuration parameters. So if you're at the point where you're deriving actual device configuration from the data in your source of truth, you're going to find, you know, different protocols to different nerd knops and things like that. And there might be use cases for custom fields where you need to define that data somewhere within the topology of the network data model. So let's take a quick look at that. So this is Nautobot. I'm going to do a series of demos for you here. So let's actually take a look at what custom fields look like and how they interact and things by actually creating a new one. So for that, let's create a new custom field for an interface role. I'm going to make this a selection type. So in the UI, it's going to be a dropdown of values that a user can select from. Let's create one for interface role. We are going to assign this to the interface object, so device interfaces, and then we'll have a set of choices here for maybe this one role would be access, another would be uplink, just as an example. You can have lots of more choices as well. So once that's been created, we can go and find a device here. Say this guy right here who has 62 interfaces. So you know, obviously we can edit one of these interfaces here. We scroll down and we find that we have our custom fields. So let's create this interface as an uplink interface because it was connected to something else in the UI. And once that's there, you know, we can view that interface and we can see that it has its interface role as uplink. And of course, this data is exposed in the API, and you'll see later in GraphQL as well. So that's very important. But the key concept here is that field interface role doesn't exist out of the box. I have a specific organizational use case which dictates the need for that field interface role, because somewhere in my automation tooling, I'm making decisions about what the value is for this particular interface. Like obviously there's different types of configuration that I'm going to apply to an uplink interface versus an access interface, and so on. So that's kind of custom fields. So next up, let's talk about custom relationships. This is a very fun one. So again, relationships allow creating data associations that are meaningful to you as an organization, you as an end user, that may not make sense to everyone else, right? So as I mentioned, the core data model exists out of the box, and it comes with a series of relationships. The data model is, implemented as a, in a relational database context. So there's natural relationships that exist. And again, that core data model is trying to implement the broadest set of use cases for, everyone's network out there. But again, an organization is going to have needs that go beyond those existing relationships. And so some of those might be, VLANs to a device level. Perhaps you want to assign an IP address to a specific VLAN so that you can, reference that VLAN's layer 3 interface. Other use cases which are quite interesting is like if you have a specific network design for, say, retail site deployments, where you need to know in an HA deployment, what is the primary device at this site and what is the secondary. Relationships will allow you to do that association that you may not have been able to do naturally in any other sort of sense, or it's just easier to do it this way. So again, this diagram over here, what we're showing in the black, that's the core native data model, and in green, we can create any sort of relationship between these models that we need to service our needs. So let's take a look at a specific example here. Let's create a relationship to model the management VLAN for a rack. So let's create a new relationship here. We'll call this rack management VLAN, if I can spell. Let's see. So in this particular case, we get a couple of options, and this plays homage again to the fact that the core data model is implemented in a relational database sense. So there's different types of relationships that we can create. Like a one-to-one relationship, where one object can only map to one other object, or one-to-many, where one object can map to many different objects on the other side of the relationship, or obviously many-to-many also as well. So in this particular case, I'm going to say that in my network design, I'm provisioning unique VLANs for every rack for management purposes. So in my use case, I want this to be a one-to-one relationship, so that what this will restrict is that if I have already provisioned a VLAN and assigned it to a rack for management purposes, that I won't be able to use that VLAN as the management VLAN for another rack. And again, that's going to depend on organizational specific use cases, but just as an example. So I'm going to say the source side is a rack, and the other side is a VLAN, which is right here. So I'm going to create this. What's also interesting, and unfortunately we don't have enough time to go into it in today's presentation, but we allow filtering on these relationships. So what that opens the door to is if you have an association between a pair of objects for a specific use case, it might make sense in only some contexts, right? Like I might need to associate use a previous use case, a device to a site to reference the primary device, but I only want to do that for, say, a firewall type. So I'm doing like an HA firewall deployment. I can be able to filter these relationships so that I can only apply those, associations on one side to devices that have a role of firewall, for instance. So quite powerful in that sense. So we'll create that relationship here. So we have our rack management VLAN, and if we come over to our racks and choose this first one here, see that we have our relationship defined here, VLAN, but we don't have an association yet. So this would be like, if you're looking at a REST API, this would be like a null value for this association right now. But if I edit this rack and I scroll down, I've got my relationships, and I can pick from my list of VLANs, and we'll say that this is the management VLAN that should exist for this rack. And we'll create that, update this device, scroll down, and that association has been made here. And what's nice in the web UI, of course, these become links, and we can go over to that VLAN and see all of its properties. And likewise, we see the inverse side of that relationship. We see the rack that this VLAN has been assigned to. So quite powerful in that sense.
John, I've got a question for you. If we were to run this into like a brownfield environment where, I don't know, organizations were making spreadsheets to keep track of all this stuff, or like rack tables to use your example here, is it possible to maybe import the data that's there and then sort of manually change up those relationships, or how can you get like all your stuff into this without doing it all manually?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that often comes up right in this context of brownfield networking and solutions like Nautobot. Is people will see it and say, "Oh, I've got 1,000 different devices and hundreds of thousands of interfaces. How could I ever get all of that into the source of truth correctly?" Right? So we have several different solutions to that problem. Kind of first and foremost, you can do bulk imports like CSV data. There's REST API interfaces where you can manipulate that data and so forth. We also have some plugins around onboarding of devices where you can go out and actually do network discovery and have the plugin actually import all of that data in. For relationships specifically to that question, absolutely yes. That is well baked into that existing feature set and ecosystem. So you can also do things like define a relationship up front, not make it required, get all of your data in here, and then go back after the fact once it's all correct and mark that relationship as required, so that when you create a new entity down the road, you get that sort of data validation in there. And I'll be talking specifically about data validation in a little bit later that may also address some of these concerns, or at least perhaps spark some ideas around how we can come up with solutions for that.
Cool.
Great
Thank you
question,
very
though.
much. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So that's relationships. The last thing that I want to go over, and unfortunately we don't have much time for a demo for this one, but I will say that you will see this specific feature set used a lot in later presentations going through today. And that is plugins and the plugin and app ecosystem. So plugins allow developers to really come up with and implement entirely new functionality sets that ride on top of the core of Nautobot. And this really breaks at a high level into two categories of functionality. This kind of this idea of like lightweight extensions, where you're using some aspects of the plugin API to do certain things, but you're not, building a full-blown application. And the other one is, of course, applications where you're using the broadest set of the feature set that's available within the plugins API to do things like provide new models. So again, I mentioned kind of earlier on, like one neat interesting use case is a plugin around BGP peerings, for instance. You can create new views, and what's nice about that is in Nautobot, the plugin API that we've got, all of those views that you create will look and feel like the rest of the core application itself quite easily. And then obviously you can create your own REST APIs with your own plugins. One neat feature that you'll also see a little bit later throughout the presentation as well is the ability for a plugin to inject content into core pages. So if we think about, if we're creating a plugin that's adding a new model, and that model might have a relationship to an existing core model, well, maybe it makes sense, say, to like on a device, if I want to inject content, if I'm viewing a device in Nautobot, that I would want to see content that plugin is providing. You can do that quite easily. And then this last bullet point here that I'll talk about in a little bit later on as well is data validation. This is a brand new feature to the plugins API in Nautobot, where you can implement your own custom business logic to enforce data validation quite generically. That has very elegant tie-ins to the rest of the way that you manage data within Nautobot. Plugins themselves are Python packages. Specifically, they're really just a form of Django application that your end users are going to install. So organizations can create plugins that are specific to their needs. And then also we want to build an ecosystem, a community around common use cases for plugins that everyone can benefit from.
Hey, John, if I can jump in here, I think to answer Jason's question earlier, like Netbox had a plugin system, what is different? And I think at the heart of it is really the we want to really make the plugin system having feature parity with the core, which is not the case today. There's actually a lot of limitations on what you can do in the plugin system, and our goal is really to change the model. Instead of having a very opinionated data model, which has been kind of the motto of Netbox for a long time, is really having a less opinionated, more flexibility, and having a lean core, and having as much feature parity with the plugin system, so that really you can innovate and not be limited on what you can do with the plugin system. So we're not 100% there yet, but it's definitely the directions where we would like to go.